The Vietnam Anti-War Protests by Joey Clank and Dylan Maillard. December 1964. The first march to Washington protesting the Vietnam War comprised of over 20,000 people. It was one of the largest protests in U.S. history at the time. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, many Americans supported it because they were fearful of a communist takeover. What sparked this fear, though, was when Joseph McCarthy, who in February of 1950 said that communism was infiltrating the U.S. and was an extreme danger. Many people believed this theory, but as the war in Vietnam dragged on, the fear of communism began to be replaced by an anger that was fueled by the war. The growing amount of protesters felt the U.S. had been in a pointless war too long and needed to get out of it. It began, though, long before the U.S. even got involved on December 19, 1946. The war's beginning. The Vietnam War began as an argument between the Vietnamese and French over who should have control of Vietnam.
The U.S. aided the French in this war with $15 million to help supply weapons and ammunition. This is where some would say it was the start of capitalism's fight with communism because China was aiding the Vietnamese. Eventually, in the summer of 1954, a peace agreement between the French and the Vietnamese was made called the Geneva Peace Accords. In it, it stated that Vietnam would be split at the 70th parallel, giving the U.S. and French control of the South and China and the Vietnamese people control of the North. Then, in 2 years, North Vietnam would hold an election and elect a leader. This idea quickly screeched to a halt when 2 U.S. naval ships were destroyed by North Vietnamese troops, Viet Cong, on August 2nd and August 4th, 1964. This became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The U.S. responded to this as an act of war, and in March of 1965, U.S. ground troops were sent to Vietnam, signaling the official start of America's growing involvement with the war. People soon, though, started to oppose the war for numerous reasons. It was events like the My Lai Massacre which angered many American people. The My Lai Massacre was the slaughter of many innocent Vietnamese civilians by U.S. troops in Vietnam on March 16, 1968.
Other events and decisions made by the government, like the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, infuriated the majority of the American public. Agent Orange was a flammable chemical that was used to clear massive parts of jungle in Vietnam to find the enemy. This toxic chemical made many soldiers sick, leading to some deaths. It was also responsible for the destruction of many normal Vietnamese villages that had nothing to do with the Viet Cong. What angered the bulk of the American population the most was when President Richard Nixon on May 1, 1970, announced that the U.S. would withdraw from Vietnam, but days later led troops to Cambodia. This enraged the people within the U.S. because the president lied and immediately sparked more protests. A surge of protests continued to sweep the U.S. between the years of 1970 to 1972, expressing liberal ideas that went against the conservative America at the time. Students, who were mainly liberal, wanted peace, and conservatives wanted the threat of communism to be stopped from spreading across the globe. An anti-war generation was born, including people like Martin Luther King, Vietnam soldiers themselves, and hippies. The Vietnam anti-war protests were revolutionary because they changed the outcome of the war. While the emotional and political messages of the protests appealed to the majority of the American people, they were intimidating to the U.S. government. These protests eventually led to the U.S. withdrawal from the war in 1975. Revolutionary protests. The protests that were held in the U.S. regarding the Vietnam War from the years of 1966 to 1975 were revolutionary in influencing the outcome of the Vietnam War and people's opinions on the war.
Many protests appealed to the emotions of people while others just involved politics. One protest that appealed to the emotions of people was the protest at Washington in 1971. This consisted over an estimated 300,000 people. Here, military officers that had returned from Vietnam threw their medals they earned in war at the Capitol building and in trash cans. They screamed things like, "Here are my medals for being a murderer," as they threw them. Many politically driven protests were run by leaders of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Other political groups involved in the political anti-war protests were FSM, Free Speech Movement, SPU, Student Peace Union, and SANE, National Committee for Insane Nuclear Policy.
SANE, which was created in 1950, was known for the extremist ideas they expressed and was known to be one of the most radical groups. One of these ideas was reconstructing the American society entirely. Almost all of the ideas expressed by these groups contradicted what the U.S. government thought about the war and America's economy. Without these groups, the protests might not have had any impact on the war at all. Other political events and protests were Woodstock in 1969 and the 1969 Immobilization March, which comprised of over 800,000 people. It was protests and events like these that changed the minds of several Americans when it came to the Vietnam War, as seen in Gallup polls taken from August of 1965 to May of 1971. In 1965, 52% of Americans approved of the war. This decreased drastically over the next few years, hitting an all-time low of 28% in May of 1971. A deadly response. The U.S. government reacted to the Vietnam anti-war protests because of growing violence involved in them and the fact that they were intimidating to the U.S. government. An example of this would be the Kent State Massacre that occurred on May 4, 1970. Students attending this rally were protesting the invasion into Cambodia. When the protests began on May 2, 1970, they started out peacefully but suddenly took a violent turn. Bonfires were set in the middle of roads and glass bottles were smashed on police cars. An ROTC, Reserves Officers Training Corps, building was even singed to the ground by student protesters. The situation at Kent State soon became too much for local police forces to handle. This was why Ohio National Guardsmen were called on May 4th to contain this violence that was once a small, peaceful protest. When the guards arrived, rocks and other objects were thrown at them by protesters. Tear gas was fired along with other non-lethal weapons. What several did not know was that the guards were carrying automatic rifles with knives on the end. When the guards thought they had run out of non-lethal weapons and ammunition, which they still had plenty of, they pointed their guns at protesters but did not fire. They then pointed their weapons at protesters a second time and for a reason unknown unloaded the guns into the crowd of protesters. 4 pairs whose names were Allison Cross, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schuer, and William Schroeder. More than a dozen others were wounded. Soon after this, more than 100 universities nationwide went inactive as a way to protest government brutality at Kent State. People now did not only protest the war, but were protesting the government itself. The government did not really seem to care about what happened at Kent State, but actually organized pro-war protests to counter the anti-war protests. One of these protests would be the Hard Hat Riot on May 8, 1970. It happened when construction workers who were working in Lower Manhattan, New York, became furious with people protesting the Kent State Massacre because they supported the war. When they started to counter-protest, things quickly became violent. Windows of buildings were smashed and more than 1,000 Kent State protesters were attacked. In the end, 70 people were injured, including 4 policemen. The Vietnam anti-war protests were not only recognized as the most successful protests in history, but showed how inhumane the government can be in warfare. A country healing. The Vietnam anti-war protests caused the U.S. government's withdrawal from the Vietnam War, passed bills to stay out of other wars that could start, including Vietnam, ended the draft, and turned a predominantly conservative America into a predominantly liberal America. This all happened in the span of a little over 15 years, from about 1957 to 1975, the end of the war. Because the Democratic Party predominantly ran the protests, liberal ideas were expressed constantly, promoting peace and love. People involved in them questioned the need to be the global policeman. The more protests there were, the more people started to support them, soaking up liberal ideas like a sponge. Eventually, with the pressure of the majority of the American public and all of these groups combined, the U.S. government finally decided to leave Vietnam and neighboring countries on April 30, 1975, therefore ending the war. With the war over and the troops out of Vietnam, there was no more draft for the war, so troops were not being deployed. A number of bills were also passed following the war's end, ensuring the U.S. would stay out of other wars, including Vietnam. One of these bills was the 1973 Wars Powers Resolution. This kept the U.S. troops out of Vietnam and other countries for at least 90 days. With these bills and others like them, it prevented funding for wars that could potentially occur in the future. This was important to the restructure of America's economy. In total, the U.S. spent over $167 billion in Vietnam in order to fund the war, so the people who passed these bills thought it was a good way to stop wasteful spending. The protests' impacts today. For once in America's history, the U.S. had lost a war that people thought would never end, but after more than 1 decade it did. With the end of the Vietnam War, the protests ended, the U.S.'s economy healed, and the American public was finally satisfied with what the government did.
The Vietnam anti-war protests truly influenced future protests of wars like the Iraq War the U.S. is currently fighting in. A specific example of how the Vietnam protests influenced Iraq protests is that in the Iraq protests, more than 300,000 protesters flooded Washington on September 24, 2005, exactly what the Vietnam anti-war protesters did. Similar to the Vietnam anti-war protests, people disagreed with the government's decisions on the war because the government had lied about the cause of the Iraq War. An Iraq protester named Chad Hetman said, "We're here to bring a dose of reality to the American public. This war is based on lies." By the end of that day, the Washington police had arrested 2 of the protesters. Many Vietnam protesters were also arrested. A main Iraq War protester by the name of Cindy Sheehan said, "We need a people's movement to end this war," which is what the main belief of the Vietnam anti-war protesters was. No matter what reason one gives for entering a country into war, people are going to dislike it. In both of these cases where protesters were fighting the government, it was not a war on terrorism or communism, but simply a war on political differences.